Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I want you to think for a moment about your favorite story. Your favorite story. And I want you to think about how it ends. And I want to contemplate today what makes a good ending of a story. Right? How do we, when we're reading something, we're reading a great novel, we're reading a great book, and we get to an ending and we say to ourselves, wow, that was a great story and a great ending. You walk away feeling that satisfaction. What constitutes a great ending? What do you think for you? What constitutes great ending? Please. Resolution, right? Resolution. All of the loose ends, right, are tied up nicely. A good detective novel wouldn't be such a good ending if you didn't find out at the end who did it. Right? There needs to be a resolution of some sort. I like that. Yes, Marge.
I don't think the resolution always has to be a happy ending.
Oh, agreed. Yeah.
Right. So, like to me, it's like there's meaning in the ending.
Okay, good. So resolution, Marge is saying, doesn't always have to be happy. Life isn't always, a lot of things get resolved not necessarily in the way we want them to be, but there needs to be meaning, is what you're saying. I like that. So we've got resolution, we've got meaning. Neil?
For me, a lesson learned.
There's a lesson learned, right? There's a lesson learned. You know, the best examples of those are, Aesop's fables, where the whole point of the story is you walk away with something, right? You don't just end it and say, okay, I haven't learned anything. You walk away with something. Michal?
I'm thinking of two things that one being that despite whatever suffering there's some hope for the future. And also that in some way it appeals to me personally, or it's applicable to something in my life too.
So you said two things, both of which I think are important. Michal said, first of all, that there's some hope for the future. And I'll reshape that a little bit and to say, sometimes a good ending, while there's an ending and a conclusion, it also leaves open for a sequel, right? For something to come later. So that's not unheard of in our endings. And I lost the train of thought of what you said the second one, which was?
That there's something in it that I can relate to personally.
Thank you. There's something in it that you can relate to personally, right? It kind of goes together with Neil's lesson. If it's a lesson that's just, for the general society that I don't really understand, it's not going to be as satisfying as something that I can walk away saying, oh, that speaks to me, right? That speaks to me. Do you want to say something, Brett?
I was going to say something, I like an ending that inspires you into action.
Good. An ending that inspires you into action. So all of these are different ways that we can end stories. So my question for today, since we are ending a story, is this a good ending? Right? Is this a good ending based on all of these things that we said? So let's open up our Chumashim, the other of the books that are in front of you, the larger red book, to page, let's open it to page 310. We can technically go to the bottom of 309. So Joseph and his father's household remained in Egypt. Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph lived to see his children, the third generation of Ephraim, the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were likewise born upon Joseph's knees. At length Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die. God will surely take notice of you and bring you up from this land to the land that he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, when God has taken notice of you, you shall carry up my bones from here. Joseph died at the age of 110 years. He was embalmed and placed in a coffin of Egypt. End scene. All right. Is it a good ending? Is it not a good ending? And why? We're gonna see who wants to argue which side of this. Marge?
I think the problem is we know the rest of the story.
So the problem is, Marge is saying, we know the rest of the story. I'm going to reshape the problem and say, if we didn't know the rest of the story, it's not done. Right? Well, what happens next? We're supposed to go back. The whole point of Genesis is we're supposed to go back into the land of Israel. And we don't. So from the resolution side of it, right, Sophia is going to be very unsatisfied with this ending, right? The resolution isn't there. There may be a resolution of there is a resolution of the family conflict, by the way, right? The family has gotten back together again, but the larger story, there's no resolution for. Bob?
Well, maybe a good story doesn't have to have a resolution. Maybe a good story has anticipation at the end, making you want to read more.
So, Bob is arguing maybe a good story has some anticipation at the end, making you want to read more. And I think so. Look, there are definitely... Hollywood makes money with cliffhangers, right? There's no doubt. But at some point in time, the series needs to end, right? And so if at the end of the series there's no resolution, I think people do feel a little unsatisfied. People feel like, well, what's going to happen? There have been a number of movies that I've watched at the end that have left it very open, and I walked away saying, really? That's it? What happens to this person? What happens to that person? And, the artistic answer to that will be, well, they leave it to the audience's own mind to decide what happens. Well, if I wanted that, I would tell the story myself, right? I want to see what happens. I want to see the arc. I want that conclusion. Yes, Michal.
I feel pretty satisfied because Joseph did know a lot of things that were going to happen in the future, whether it was interpreting dreams or just his own inclination or whatever. And he brought up the main theme, that you will go back to where you were promised.
Interesting. So Michal's answer is an interesting answer. Michal is satisfied because the character is satisfied. And there's a difference, obviously, between the character and the reader, right? The character has sort of closed his arc, but it's not necessarily the arc of the reader. We know that the story is going to continue next week, by the way. Come back next week and you'll hear the next part of the story. And it begins with another challenge, right? There arose a Pharaoh in Egypt who didn't know Joseph. And it takes us into the whole next iteration of the story of Exodus that leads us into the land of Israel ultimately. But the book of Genesis doesn't end us there. Yes, sir?
I think it's a good ending because it wraps up the smaller conflict, but leaves the larger conflict still open to continue.
Okay. So it's a good ending because Shimon said it's a good ending because it wraps up the smaller conflict, but it leaves the larger one still open to continue in the story. Yes?
And I think it also brings ambiguity, which is not a bad ending as well.
Yeah.
We don't know exactly what he was going to tell, and it is many versions possibly of the hope of our people, including that return to Egypt, made something clear.
Yes. Yes, it leaves open ambiguity. It leaves open the story to not, and there is a positive to that as well. So it's interesting that we, especially in the modern world, have come to expect endings that wrap everything up neatly, right? I just finished rereading one of my favorite fantasy novel series of all times. I usually start it sometime in the summertime, and it's actually a 10-book series, 2 5-book series from an author by the name of David Eddings. If you're a fantasy guy and you haven't read it, come talk to me about it at lunch. It's great. But, right, at the very end, the last line after every problem has been resolved, right? And the last paragraph is, then, with light bathing their faces, the 3 friends started down from the snowy hilltop to view that miracle which, though it is most commonplace, is a miracle nonetheless. And so, my children, the time has come to close the book. There will be other days and other stories, but this tale is finished. Close the book. Right? That's what we're looking for. And yet, that's not the way our texts are written. That's not the way our texts are written. And it's not just the book of Genesis. And Rabbi Sachs actually picked up on this and saw this. And he quotes a work called The Human Condition by Hannah Arendt, who gives a reason potentially why. First of all, he shows that we, the reader, know, right? For our story in this to end, we have to get back to the land of Israel. That's how our story ends. We know that. And yet we're not there yet. So the story is as yet unconcluded. But when we look at the next section of the Tanakh, right, the book of prophets, it ends with the book of Malachi. And the ending of that is, "See, I will send you the prophet Elijah. Before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord, he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of their children to the fathers." That's the end of Malachi. Again, it's talking about the future. We don't know yet. We have hope. We don't know yet what's going to be there. And if you look at the end of the book of Chronicles, and for those who are interested, if you've never heard of the book, how many people have heard of the book of Chronicles? A few. Actually, if you've grown up in a Christian tradition, you're much more likely to have heard of the book of Chronicles as the end of the Old Testament than you are if you grew up in the Jewish tradition, right? It's not a book that we typically study. And so, starting in February, this is a shameless plug, starting in February, as a continuation of my classes, my series on the book of the obscure books of the classes on the obscure books of the Bible, we're going to be studying the book of Chronicles. And the end of Chronicles also leaves it open, right? Leaves it open. So we seem to have a habit of ending our stories without truly bringing them to that wrapped up, neat end. The question is why? What does that teach us? What do you think? Please. There's always something else that you need to do, right? Our story isn't ended. It still hasn't ended for thousands of years. It hasn't ended, yes.
But we all have to live with an uncertain future.
Good, right? The reality of an uncertain future, we all live with that. We all live with that. We don't know, right? We don't know. So how does Hannah Arendt sort of talk about this? She says that human action is potentially tragic, and we can never foresee the consequences of our acts. But once done, it can never be undone. And she goes on, I'm quoting her now, she says, "One who acts never quite knows what he or she is doing, and he always becomes guilty of consequences that he never intended or even foresaw." There's this reality in our life that we tend to forget about. That what we do now may have waves of repercussion long after we're gone. And so our story even doesn't end. Because the choices that we make as a parent will affect the choices that our children make long after we're gone. And so in essence, our story is not over yet. Now, she writes in an interesting sort of way. She's like, well, how do we deal with that? Well, because we Jews especially, but a lot of people, like, if that's the way we think about things, my consequences live on forever, might that paralyze me into not wanting to do anything? Because I don't want to mess things up. I don't want to do something that is going to potentially have consequences that I'm going to be guilty for down the road. And so what she argues, and it's a very Jewish perspective, is what transforms the human situation from tragedy into hope is the possibility of forgiveness. Without being forgiven, released ultimately from those consequences of what we've done, our capacity to act would be confined to one single deed from which we could never recover, because we could never be truly sure of what those ultimate consequences are going to be. How do we live with that? And she argues that forgiveness is what allows us to say, I understand there may be consequences, but the people around me, please God, will forgive me for those, because I couldn't see it, I didn't know. And that ties us into the end of our story in Genesis. Because ultimately, the end of the Joseph story is forgiveness. That's what it comes down to. That's how it ends. That's what ultimately allows the brothers to come back together again after everything that went on, after this truly dysfunctional story of kidnapping and dreams and all sorts of things like that, right? What allows everybody to come back together again is forgiveness. And it's forgiveness on all parties. It's forgiveness of the brothers of Joseph. It's forgiveness of Joseph of the brothers. And it's forgiveness of Jacob of all of his children. And maybe even the other way, of the children of Jacob. It all comes to a conclusion in those moments of forgiveness. And so in a powerful way, the end of the book of Genesis is trying to teach us these two lessons. One, our story never ends. And the consequences of our actions may go on for many, many generations without us even ever knowing it, for good or for ill. But how do we stop from allowing that to paralyze us? We recognize the power of forgiveness. To say we're only human, we're going to make mistakes, and therefore we do the best that we can to tie up our story, to bring those things together, but there are always going to be those ends that just aren't neatly tied up the way it can happen in Disney, the way it can happen in some of these great fantasy novels where everything is good and everyone is perfect. It's not the way of human beings. Any thoughts or comments before we actually now read the end of the story and move into our Torah readings? Excellent. Shabbat shalom, everyone.